Tonight, we drift down toward a frozen world where the night does something unusual. When the sunlight fades, enormous flowers begin to open across the plains, filling the cold air with soft light and drifting mist. As the darkness deepens, the landscape slowly changes, revealing patterns and cycles that only exist after sundown. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's explore the quiet side of this chilly planet together. From a distance, the planet sits in the cold dark with a faint halo wrapped around it, the kind that only shows up when your eyes settle long enough. Most worlds reflect their stars with sharp edges, but this one has a softer glow, almost like the light is sinking into the atmosphere before it ever has a chance to bounce back. It gives the whole sphere a chilled, muted look, as if the surface temperature has shaped the color of the air itself. As we drift closer, patches of pale blue and silver stretch across the night side. These aren't oceans. They move too slowly and sit too still. They look more like wide fields of frost, a kind that forms in deep layers, giving the ground a brushed metallic tone. In a few places, the darkness is broken by faint threads of pink, almost invisible until you're staring directly at them. They run in lines that are too perfectly curved to be rivers and too wide to be cracks. They seem to pulse, not with brightness but with warmth. Just a hint, like the planet is hiding heat beneath the cold. It's subtle, but it's there. The clouds become clearer as the atmosphere thickens beneath us. They don't swirl the way storms normally do. They drift like sheets being dragged along by a slow current, untouched by anything violent. Thin streaks of ice crystals stretch between them, catching starlight in a way that makes them appear sharper than the clouds around them. Every layer looks calm, as if the weather here rarely rushes. Dropping lower, the planet reveals its surface in pieces. Shadows carve out long stretches of terrain where low ridges and shallow basins blend into each other without harsh cliffs or towering mountains. Everything feels rounded by time and cold, shaped by countless cycles of freezing and thawing. The ground color changes as we sink further into the haze, from silver to muted lavender, then deeper greens that only show themselves when the starlight hits the right angle. And then the first sign of life becomes clear. Dotting the surface are enormous shapes, far larger than anything a forest could hide. They aren't trees, and they aren't rock formations. They rise out of the ground like thick, curved spires, each one ending in a closed bloom the size of a small hill. Dozens of them scatter across the landscape in loose clusters, some reaching higher than others, some leaning slightly as though shaped by gentle winds over many seasons. In the daylight side, they look dormant, still as stone, holding in whatever warmth the world refuses to give. The closer we drift, the more detail settles into view. The petals are layered with tough, fibrous patterns, almost like overlapping plates rather than anything soft. Frost clings to their surfaces, forming pale rings that trace each fold. The stems widen at the base, sinking deep into the earth, anchoring themselves against the cold plains. Nothing around them disturbs the ground. No trails, no scratches, no signs of creatures passing between them. Just quiet. The atmosphere at this height carries a faint shimmer, as if something invisible is seeping upward from the surface. Not heat exactly, but a slow release of energy from the planet's crust. It gives the air a slight distortion, enough to make the horizon waver in gentle waves. Even from up here, it feels like a world that saves its strength for the night. Past the horizon, on the night side, some of the flowers are already beginning to shift. It's subtle. A loosened petal here, a faint glow around the edges there, but the change carries a sense of timing, as though the entire species responds to the fall of light with the same long, deliberate breath. The glow isn't bright. It sits close to the surface of each bloom, a soft warmth that pushes the frost outward. The mist rising from the cracks between petals drifts low to the ground, hugging the terrain in a quiet blanket of color. We don't get too close yet, not enough to disturb anything, just enough to see how the planet moves through its night. A slow rotation, a surface that cools to dangerous temperatures once the sun slips away. And these giant flowers, seemingly built for the cold, waiting for the dark so they can open and release whatever life depends on that nightly warmth. The world feels patient, not empty, like it's preparing itself for what comes next. The night here isn't a quiet absence. It's the beginning of something the planet has been holding on to all day long. And as we sink deeper through the last layers of atmosphere, the ground approaches steadily, bringing those enormous blooms into full view for the first time, right before they begin to open. The first bloom below us begins to shift fully now, its petals loosening one by one with a slow, heavy motion. They don't peel back quickly. They ease outward as if every plate of fiber is waking stiff from the cold. Frost cracks along the edges, falling away in thin sheets that break apart before they ever reach the ground. The inside of the flower glows with a gentle orange tone, warm enough that steam rolls upward in thin curls. More of the flowers follow. Not in unison, but close enough that the landscape changes little by little, each bloom adding its own patch of light to the dark plain. From above, the openings look like a scattering of quiet hearths lit across frozen fields, each one creating a pocket of survivable warmth in a world that drops far below freezing once the sun disappears. The mist they release is different from regular steam. It has weight to it, sinking instead of floating, spreading across the ground until whole valleys are covered in a blanket of soft, shimmering air. Up close, the mist carries faint flickers of blue and red, as though small particles inside it shift between colors depending on how the warm cores breathe out heat. The surface beneath it softens in tone too, the frost melting into thin patches that reveal more of the planet's natural colors, muted greens, deeper violets, and the occasional line of darker soil. Something moves inside that mist. Not fast and not loud, just a dim outline brushing across the glow. At first, it's easy to assume the warmth coming from the flowers is shaping the haze into strange forms, but then another shape slips through it, and another behind that. They're low to the ground, almost gliding, their bodies hidden more often than revealed. Only when they pass directly beneath an open bloom does their form become clearer. They're slender creatures with long limbs that move in smooth steps, their skin reflecting just enough of the flower light to give them a pale copper sheen. They keep close to the warmth, weaving under the petals where the heat is strongest. Whatever they are, they seem adapted for this nightly ritual. Their movements calm, their pace steady, as though they've done this every night for generations. None of them appear startled by the flower's opening. If anything, they seem drawn to it, following invisible paths carved out by instinct. Further out, at the base of a larger bloom, the ground shifts in a different way. A section of soil trembles slightly, not from weight but from something underneath pushing upward. A small mound forms, cracks, and then splits open as a smaller creature climbs through with careful limbs. Its surface is coated in frost, as if it slept beneath the ground until the warmth signaled it to rise. Once free, it shakes off the crystals and makes its way directly into the glowing mist, navigating without hesitation. The atmosphere carries a change as more flowers reach full bloom. The heat they release gathers in layers, lifting the cold just enough that the surrounding clouds thin out overhead. The night sky becomes clearer, revealing a band of faint stars stretched over the horizon. Their light blends with the glow from the blooms, giving the whole region a mixed tone. Cold light above, warm light below. As we continue drifting forward, a new cluster of flowers comes into view. These ones are larger, bending slightly outward as if shaped by stronger winds. Their petals unfold at a slower rate, each layer revealing another beneath it, like a long process that can't be rushed. When they finally open, the mist that spills out has a deeper color, almost gold at the edges. Creatures gather around them too, but these are different. Taller, with wide-set limbs and long, thin necks that sway as they move through the haze. They keep more distance from the blooms, circling calmly, their movements cautious rather than curious. Beyond them, the terrain rises into a gentle slope leading toward a long ridge. Even from here, the pattern of life changes. The flowers become sparser, spaced out as though the ground beneath the ridge holds less warmth. In their place, smaller plants cling to the frost, tiny clusters of bioluminescent buds, no larger than the tip of a finger. They glow faintly with a pale green hue, steady and unchanging, likely a daytime species saving its energy for sunrise. The air grows colder the farther we move from the main cluster of blooms. The mist thins, and the ground returns to its silvered texture. Every sound, if there even are any, becomes muffled beneath the frozen surface, leaving the scenery quiet again. Only the distant glow behind us gives away the presence of life. Ahead, the ridge levels out into a wider plain where a single enormous bloom dominates the landscape. This one is older, easily the largest we've seen. Its petals have thickened with age, each layer showing deep grooves carved by seasons of opening and closing. The frost on it is heavier too, coating the upper edges in a pale crust that catches the faint starlight. It hasn't opened yet. Everything around it feels as though it is waiting. No creatures circle it, no mist spills from it. The air here is still, carrying the weight of cold without interruption. Whatever this bloom holds, it releases only when it decides the time is right. For now it rests, sealed tight, storing heat beneath layers built to withstand a world where warmth is a luxury. And in the quiet around it, the temperature drops again, as if the planet is reminding us that this place is not ruled by the flowers. They simply borrow the night for as long as they can. The massive bloom stands alone for a long stretch of land, its shadow stretching wider than anything else nearby. Even without opening, it gives off a faint presence, like the cold itself bends slightly around it. The petals stay sealed, layered tightly together, each one marked with thick ridges that look more like hardened plates than anything delicate. Ice has gathered in the grooves, forming irregular lines that run from the tip all the way to the base. None of it melts, even though every other bloom across the plains releases warmth the moment they open. The ground around it tells a different story. The frost is thicker here, pushed outward in uneven waves, almost as if the area has gone through long cycles of freezing and shifting. Beneath the frost, the soil is darker, nearly black in some places, hinting that something beneath the ground has been disturbed repeatedly over countless nights. Whatever this bloom does when it opens, it clearly shapes the land more strongly than its younger counterparts. There's a silence around it, deeper than the stillness of the plains we crossed earlier. Even the creatures that wandered freely through the glowing mist give this place a wide berth. In the far distance, where the smaller blooms release their warmth, faint silhouettes still move through the haze, but none drift toward this ridge. It's not fear exactly. It feels more like a natural boundary, as if the ecosystem itself understands that this solitary bloom is part of a longer cycle, and nothing interferes with it. The temperature drops further the closer we drift. Each breath of air seems sharper here, the cold settling in layers that cling to the ground. Frost patterns spread outward from the bloom's base like branching lines, thin at first, then thicker, forming a network across the ridge. They pulse slightly, not with light but with pressure, as if the soil is adjusting beneath them. Then something changes. It's small at first, a faint tremor at the base of the bloom, subtle enough that it might be overlooked. But it repeats, a slow, deep thud, like the sound of something heavy shifting far beneath the surface. A crack forms along one of the outer petals, thin and short, but unmistakable. Ice falls from it in a quiet cascade, scattering across the frost before settling still again. The bloom still doesn't open. But whatever is happening inside, it is preparing the outer layers, loosening the shell. The ground follows with another tremor, slightly broader this time, rolling through the soil like a slow ripple. Frost shakes loose from the ridges and drifts downward in light flakes. A low haze begins to seep from the very bottom edge of the bloom, not bright, not warm, just a pale, cold mist that sinks down the slope. It moves differently from the warm vapor released by the younger blooms. This mist crawls close to the ground, creeping outward rather than rising. As it spreads, the temperature drops further still, and the frost thickens into a harder coat, almost glass-like. Whatever warmth this planet has stored for the night, this bloom is not borrowing it. It's doing something else entirely. Past the ridge, something stirs in the shadows. At first it looks like nothing more than a slight shift in the darkness, but then a figure steps through the pale glow. One of the tall creatures from earlier, the ones with long necks and wide-set limbs, approaches slowly, keeping its distance but watching the unopened bloom with steady, deliberate steps. It pauses at the edge of the frost network, lowering its head as if listening for something. Its breath fogs in long streams, hinting just how cold this place truly is compared to the warmer fields behind us. The creature gives one quiet grunt, a low, vibrating sound, and then retreats. Not hurried, not panicked, just deliberate. The kind of movement that shows familiarity with this event. It leaves the area exactly as it found it, vanishing back into the dim haze where other distant flowers glow with orange and gold. The bloom trembles again. This time the movement is strong enough to send a deep crack slicing along two of the outer plates, ending just short of the tip. Another piece of ice breaks away. The ground around the bloom tightens as the frost shifts, pulling inward slightly, as though the soil itself is reacting to the internal pressure. For a moment, everything goes still again. No mist, no tremor, no movement at all. And then the temperature jumps, not up, but down, in a sudden rush that steals color from the air. The cold becomes sharp enough that even the starlight seems clearer, as if the atmosphere thinned in seconds. A ring of frost circles the bloom as the ground prepares itself for whatever comes next. It's clearly not ready to open yet, but the cycle has begun. Something inside is gathering strength, and every part of the landscape around it responds in its own quiet way. The night on this planet may belong to the glowing blooms across the plains, but here, in the shadow of the oldest one, the cold holds authority, and whatever emerges from this giant sealed flower will reshape the ridge in a way the younger blooms never could. This place feels like the turning point of the night. A quiet pause before the world shows the deeper part of itself. The stillness around the ancient bloom stretches on, the frost tightening further across the ridge as if the air is settling into its coldest point. Even the atmosphere feels thinner here, the kind of thin that makes every movement seem louder despite the silence. The unopened petals stay locked in place, but the tension beneath them grows more obvious with each passing moment. A faint creak rolls through the structure, not sharp, just a deep strain from layers that haven't moved in a long time. A pale line of condensation gathers around the base again, but this time it doesn't spill outward. It stays close, circling the bloom like a ring of chilled breath trapped against the ground. The frost shifts with a soft, brittle sound, cracking in narrow veins that spread outward before fading. Each line seems to follow the shape of roots hidden beneath the surface, suggesting the plant's reach extends far beyond the ridge. Then the first major shift happens. A heavy thud pushes through the ground, stronger than any of the tremors before it. It sends a small cloud of frost dust rising into the air in a low burst before settling again. The bloom leans a fraction to one side, barely noticeable at first, but it holds that position as though adjusting the angle of its own weight. Another thud follows, this time from deeper inside, echoing up through the layers and out across the ridge. the petals still don't open. Instead, the bloom releases a slow stream of cold vapor directly upward from a thin gap forming at the very top. The mist rises straight, unaffected by any wind, suggesting the air is almost completely still here. The vapor is faintly tinted with blue, and as it climbs, it leaves a shimmering trail behind it before dispersing into the dark. Far below, where the younger blooms are fully open, a distant glow still paints the plains with soft colors. From here, they look like tiny clusters of warm embers scattered across a frozen surface. The creatures that roamed the mist earlier have mostly disappeared back into the haze, returning to their usual patterns, as though they understand that whatever happens on the ridge is not part of their nightly routine. One creature remains at the edge of the slope though, a smaller one, the kind that crawled from beneath the soil earlier. It sits low to the frost, body flattened slightly, watching the massive bloom with careful stillness. Its skin, now free of the thick frost it shed earlier, reflects the faint blue light from the vapor overhead. It doesn't move forward and doesn't retreat. It simply observes, as if waiting for a signal that hasn't come yet. The bloom gives another deep internal shift. This one is different. Slower, heavier, like something turning within the structure. The petals respond with a groan that rolls across the ridge, a sound thick enough that even the thin atmosphere can't hide it. Several cracks appear along the upper layers, branching downward in unpredictable lines. Frost falls from them in a continuous stream now, covering the lower petals in a fresh coat that looks like powdered glass. As the cracks widen, a faint glow begins to push through them, not warm like the younger blooms, not golden or orange. This glow is cool, almost silver, carrying the sharp clarity of something that stores light differently. It reveals the inner layers of the bloom in quick flashes, tightly woven fibers, thick seams, and a faint pulse deep within the center. Whatever energy the plant holds, it's far stronger than anything released by the smaller blooms across the plains. The ground responds again. The frost network tightens, pulling inward as if the soil is reacting to the internal buildup. Small patches of darker earth appear between the ice lines, warmed just enough to push the frost aside a few millimeters. The bloom's roots must be shifting beneath the surface, drawing in whatever minerals or moisture they need for the opening. The creature on the slope finally reacts. It lowers itself further, flattening completely against the frost, its limbs tucked close. It isn't hiding, it's bracing, a natural instinct, probably passed down through its species for generations. This is clearly an event the smaller creatures anticipate long before it happens. A long, slow creak comes from deep inside the bloom. The cracks along the upper petals glow brighter, the silver light pulsing in steady intervals. Each pulse sends a brief flash across the frost, illuminating the ridge in a cold, clean tone. The air around the bloom grows sharper, the temperature dropping to a point where the ground begins to form new layers of ice almost instantly. And then, for the first time, one of the outer petals shifts outward. It doesn't open fully, just enough to break the locked position it has held for seasons, maybe decades. The motion sends a ripple across the entire structure, and the glow from within spills out in a concentrated band, brighter than before. Mist rushes upward, thicker and faster now, rising in a tall column that stretches into the sky like a beacon. The petal holds its new angle, and the glow softens back into a steady pulse. This is only the beginning of the blooming cycle, and it's already clear that this ancient plant operates on a different scale than anything else on the plains. Whatever it's preparing to release, light, heat, spores, or something else entirely, the planet has given it space, time, and an untouched ridge to do so. The ridge falls silent again, but it's no longer the same silence as before. This one feels like the last calm moment before the bloom truly awakens. The single petal holding itself open creates a narrow gap that exposes a deeper layer inside the bloom. The glow from within stays steady, cold and silver, giving the inner structure a clearer outline. The fibers closest to the opening contract slowly, tightening themselves like they're preparing for a larger movement still to come. Even from a distance, it's obvious this first shift is only a small part of the whole process. Another low tremor passes through the ground, not sharp enough to shake loose any ice, but strong enough to travel across the ridge like a deep rumble. The frost network reacts immediately. Some lines pull inward again, narrowing, while others push outward, forming new branches that stretch down the slope. These patterns don't appear random. They almost seem to trace pathways beneath the soil, the unseen structure of the plant's roots reacting to the internal change. The column of mist rising from the top of the bloom grows thicker. It no longer drifts lazily upward. Instead, it rises with purpose, pushed by constant pressure from inside the bloom. The color shifts slightly too, the faint blue deepening toward a soft violet that flickers at the edges. As it climbs through the cold air, the mist forms tiny crystals that glint before breaking apart higher in the atmosphere. The slope around the bloom remains quiet. The one small creature still observing keeps its low, braced posture, eyes fixed on the moving petal. Its body shudders once. A reaction to another pulse of cold radiating outward from the bloom, but it doesn't retreat. It's waiting for something specific, something it clearly expects to happen before the bloom reaches its full opening. The second shift begins with no warning at all. A deep internal pop echoes through the structure, followed by a slow, grinding sound from the lower layers. The petal that opened first tilts further, widening the gap. The inner glow grows brighter, illuminating thick strands of plant fiber that look reinforced, as if built to endure enormous pressure. Beneath them, the faint pulse of light continues, slower now, heavier, but steady enough to suggest a controlled release of energy. On the opposite side of the bloom, a second petal cracks. The crack begins at the tip and runs in a straight line down toward the base, splitting the outer plate along a natural seam. Frost breaks away in a long cascade, scattering across the ridge like shattered glass. When the crack reaches the bottom, a low hiss escapes from the gap. Not warm, not smoky, just a pressurized breath of cold vapor seeping out. The petal doesn't move yet. It just holds the crack in place, as though the bloom is synchronizing its movements before continuing. Another tremor ripples outward, this one stronger and more deliberate. The slope feels the shift immediately. Thin sheets of frost detach from the ground and slide a few inches before settling again. The cracks beneath the bloom widen, and the dark soil beneath is pushed upward in small ridges that create uneven rings around the structure. The small creature stiffens, its limbs stretching slightly as if preparing to either flee or move closer depending on what comes next. Its eyes glow faintly in the silver light, reflecting the changing colors of the mist column overhead. The second petal finally moves. It opens more smoothly than the first, swinging outward in a slow arc. The motion is steady and heavy, carrying the weight of decades of growth. Once it reaches a certain angle, it stops with a soft thud that vibrates through the ridge. With two petals open, the glow from inside the bloom becomes clearer. It no longer pulses, it streams, a steady wash of cold silver light shining from a central core, still hidden by the remaining layers. The temperature drops again, sharply enough that new frost forms instantly on the open petals, covering them in a fresh layer that crackles as it spreads. The ground reacts too. The frost network thickens and tightens around the base, locking into place in a pattern that resembles reinforced roots anchoring the structure for the next stage. More mist escapes, now from the newly opened gap. It pours out in slow waves instead of rising like the column above. This mist hugs the ground, rolling down the slope in a pale sheet that spreads outward until it meets the warmer haze drifting in the distance. When the two mists touch, they swirl around each other briefly before settling into a quiet boundary. Warm mist on one side, cold mist on the other. The creatures in the distance notice the spread. Their silhouettes shift through the warm glow, but none cross the boundary. They maintain a clear separation from the cold mist creeping outward from the ridge, as though this area belongs to a different part of the planet's cycle, one they're not meant to interfere with. Inside the bloom, something shifts again. Not a tremor this time, but a contained movement, like a large structure turning inward. The remaining petals tighten briefly, then loosen in tiny increments. A faint sound carries through the air, a soft, rhythmic scrape from deep within, steady and controlled. The inner fibers move slightly, reflecting different patterns of light with each shift. The bloom is preparing for a much larger opening. The core glow thickens, brightening just enough that the frost on the petals glitters with sharper reflections. The mist rising from the top grows taller, widening at its base as pressure builds. The ridge creaks beneath the weight of whatever is happening inside the plant structure. This is the part of the cycle where the entire ridge seems to hold itself steady, waiting for the moment when the bloom finally reveals its purpose. And for now, it continues to gather strength, the next movement promising to be the most significant one yet. The ridge stays locked in that strange stillness for several long moments. The open petals don't move, but the inner structure continues to shift in quiet, deliberate motions. Each scrape from within is slightly heavier than the last, building towards something slow and inevitable. The cold mist around the bloom thickens near the ground, flattening into a smooth layer that hides the fine cracks spreading between the roots. A deep hum rises from the soil, not sound carried through the air, but vibration passing directly through the ground. It rolls outward in a wide circle, passing beneath the frost in a single controlled wave. The pulse pushes tiny shards of ice upward, scattering them across the ridge. It feels like a signal, a preparatory motion the plant has to complete before it can open further. The mist above the bloom shifts in response. The tall column that's been rising straight into the air begins to widen, spreading outward at the top in a faint halo before thinning low in the atmosphere. The cold vapor lifts dust-sized crystals of ice into the air, forming a subtle, shimmering curtain around the top of the bloom. Each crystal catches a sliver of the silver glow from within, scattering soft fragments of light across the ridge. The third petal cracks. This one doesn't split in a straight line. The crack branches immediately, forming two thick lines that travel down separate ridges before meeting again at the base. Frost bursts off the petal in a quiet spray, drifting downward in a loose cloud. When the final crack reaches the bottom, the entire petal loosens but doesn't open immediately. Inside, the movement stops all at once. The scrapes, the pulse, the shifting fibers, everything pauses. The glow from within holds steady, bright but unmoving, as though the plant is waiting for some final balance before continuing. Even the mist halts its flow for a brief moment, suspended in the air without drifting. Then the ridge itself shifts. A low, steady rumble moves beneath the bloom, traveling downward into the deeper layers of soil. The frost network reacts violently for the first time, lines snapping and reforming, the ground bending subtly under the weight of the plant's roots adjusting. A sudden rising wave of frost pushes outward, circling the bloom like a ring expanding in all directions. When the wave reaches the edge of the ridge, it breaks into dozens of smaller lines that crawl down the slope before settling once more. Only then does the third petal begin to open. It moves faster than the first two, tilting outward in a smooth arc that reveals a much clearer view of the bloom's interior. The glow that spills out is thicker, almost tangible, lighting the frost in bright silver with a hint of deep violet. The inner layers are now visible. tightly woven fibers with small openings between them that pulse faintly, like tiny valves releasing controlled bursts of cold air. With 3 petals open, the internal temperature drops sharply. The mist rolling down the slope thickens, flowing like a slow-moving tide. The boundary where warm and cold mist meet becomes more distinct, the air forming a visible line that curves gently across the plains. The creatures out there sense the change immediately. Shadows shift in the glowing haze as they reposition themselves, forming a loose ring at a safe distance. None move closer to the ridge. The small creature that had stayed at the slope finally changes its stance. It rises from its crouched position and steps forward by a few inches, pausing again as if gauging the strength of the cold. Its eyes track the glow carefully, waiting for the exact moment it's expecting, the moment the bloom releases the first true pulse of whatever it's been storing. Inside the bloom, the silver light begins to change. It becomes thicker as though the core is stirring, but preparing to push outward. The color deepens at the center, shifting from silver to a muted blue-gray with soft fluctuations of violet. The inner fibers swell slightly with each pulse, expanding and contracting in slow, steady motions. The sound returns too, that deep scrape, heavier now, more deliberate, followed by a faint grinding noise that echoes through the ridge. The remaining petals quiver, not enough to open, but enough to show they're loosening. Frost falls from them in steady flakes, collecting in small piles at the base. Fine cracks appear near their tips, growing fraction by fraction with every pulse from the core. The bloom is aligning itself for a single large motion, the kind that will likely release whatever this ancient species uses the night for. The mist rising from the peak intensifies again. What had been a column becomes more like a broad plume, widening outward in all directions as pressure builds. The air above the bloom chills so quickly that tiny ice crystals form in mid-air, drifting downward like fine snow. They don't melt, not even when they fall near the warmer haze below. They simply settle on the frost, blending into the ridge without a trace. The creature at the slope lowers its head in a gesture that doesn't convey fear or submission, just anticipation. It knows this part of the cycle. It understands what comes next. The inner glow brightens once more, gathering strength. And then the bloom goes completely still. Not a sound, not a pulse, not a tremor. Just the silent moment the plant takes before releasing the first major burst, the event that defines the night on this ridge. Whatever happens next will change the surface in a way the younger blooms never could. The entire ridge stays frozen in that suspended moment, the kind of pause where even the air feels thinner. The open petals remain locked in place, their frost-covered surfaces catching the faintest hints of silver from the glow inside. The mist curls quietly around them, flattening against the ground as though waiting for the next shift. It doesn't take long. A deep, heavy pulse rolls through the bloom. Not fast, not sharp, but powerful enough that the ground beneath it drops a few millimeters before settling again. The frost in a wide circle jumps in a shallow ring, almost like a slow ripple pushing outward from the base. The mist around the bloom lifts slightly as the pressure underneath forces the cold air upward. Then the glow from the core thickens. It pushes outward in a steady surge, not bright enough to blind, but strong enough to coat the inside layers in a concentrated wash of light. The faint violet tones deepen, shifting into something richer, almost metallic. The inner fibers widen again, stretching with the pressure building behind them. The fourth petal cracks. This crack doesn't come quietly. It snaps in a long, echoing line that runs across the surface with a harsh, dry sound. Wide fragments of frost fly off the petal's edges, scattering across the ridge in sharp flakes that sparkle before landing. Once the crack reaches the base, the petal jolts outward a fraction, then freezes in place, held by the layers still resisting underneath. For a moment, everything inside the bloom tightens. The core glow pulls inward, The fibers constrict, the light narrows to a dense, controlled point. Then the entire structure releases. Not violently, not explosively, just a heavy, forceful shift that moves every layer of the bloom at once. The inner fibers expand fully, widening to reveal a deeper chamber inside. A wave of cold, compressed mist bursts outward through the opened gaps, rolling across the ridge in a wide, slow-moving sheet. It spreads all the way down the slope, pushing aside the earlier mist and replacing it with a thicker, colder layer. Anything warm in the air instantly transforms into tiny crystals that fall in soft, steady patterns. The fourth petal swings open. This one moves farther than the others, creating a broad view into the heart of the bloom. The inner chamber is now visible, a deep, spiraling structure lined with pulsing strands that glow in alternating strips of silver and muted violet. At the very center, a core mass pulses slowly, each contraction releasing another wave of chilled vapor that rolls outward in perfect consistency. This release is clearly the purpose of the bloom. Not light, not heat, not warmth like the younger flowers across the plains. This ancient bloom releases cold, concentrated, stored through the daylight cycle, now pushed into the atmosphere in long, controlled bursts that reshape the ridge every night. The small creature on the slope reacts immediately. It rises fully, stepping closer to the boundary where the cold mist thickens. Its limbs shift with cautious precision, as though it knows exactly how close it can get without being overwhelmed by the drop in temperature. Its breath fogs heavily, hanging low before being pulled into the drifting mist. From the plains, more movement stirs. Silhouettes gather at the edge of the warm bloom fields, forming a distant ring. The warm, glowing mist from the younger blooms stretches like a soft barrier against the cold mist spreading from the ridge. The two opposing currents swirl where they meet, creating a moving boundary that slides gradually across the terrain as the ancient bloom continues its release. Another internal shift follows. The core inside the bloom contracts again, gathering energy. The silver glow brightens, followed by another heavy wave of cold mist rolling outward with slow strength. The frost on the ground thickens immediately, forming new layers over the old ones. The air near the bloom becomes dense enough that small crystals cling to each other before falling in steady clusters. The fifth petal begins to quiver. Its surface tightens, pulling slightly inward as a new crack forces its way down the seam. The sound is softer this time, more of a deep, grinding break than a sharp snap. Frost breaks away in long strips that slide down the petal before dropping to the ground. The petal shifts outward by a fraction before locking itself in place, waiting for the next internal contraction. The ancient bloom is opening itself systematically, each petal easing the pressure so the core can continue to release its stored cold in measured waves. This isn't a chaotic event. It's a controlled cycle, part of the planet's natural temperature balance. The ridge responds every time the pulse hits. More frost, more shifting soil, more tightening in the deep root structures beneath. The air itself becomes almost motionless around the bloom, held still by the sheer weight of cold being pushed into it. The only movement comes from the mist and the crystals drifting downward. The creature at the slope stays where it is, watching with steady patience. It takes another small step closer, testing the air. Its posture changes slightly, no longer braced but focused, as though awaiting the moment when the bloom fully reveals the final layer of its inner chamber. That moment is close. The glow at the core builds again, thicker and brighter, the silver shifting into a deeper tone. The remaining petals tremble faintly, cracks forming slowly along their surfaces. The mist above the bloom widens even further, creating a broad, faintly glowing cloud that stretches out across the ridge. This is the threshold before the full bloom. One last gathering of energy, one last tightening of the inner structure. The bloom is almost ready. The glow inside the ancient bloom settles into a heavier pulse, each wave thicker and more deliberate than the last. The ridge underneath responds with a low, drawn-out vibration, as if the deep roots are tightening their hold before the final shift. Frost creeps outward another few centimeters, forming a new ring around the base that cracks softly as it hardens. The open petals stay steady, their edges sharp with fresh ice. The cold mist moving across the slope slows as the bloom draws in during the brief pause between pulses. Even the air feels held in place, dense enough that every tiny movement of the mist stands out clearly. Then the core contracts again, deeper this time. The pulse that follows is heavier than any before it. A wide wave of cold rolls outward, flattening the mist, pushing it in a slow, sweeping motion across the ridge. The frost thickens instantly wherever it touches, forming layers so dense the ground darkens beneath them. The air grows brittle enough that every breath would feel like thin shards of ice lingering in the lungs. The fifth petal cracks fully. The sound cuts through the stillness in a deep, resonant break as the fracture races down the seam. Frost falls in steady sheets, sliding off the surface in a muted cascade before shattering quietly against the ground. Once the crack reaches the base, the petal loosens its hold and swings outward in a slow arc, matching the angle of the others. With 5 petals open, the inner chamber becomes exposed enough to show how complex its structure really is. The fibers inside twist downward like layered channels, guiding the cold toward the outer petals. Each strand pulses faintly with the core, releasing a small trail of vapor that drifts into the growing plume above the bloom. The cold intensifies further. A second pulse follows almost immediately, pushing a heavier surge of mist outward. This mist is darker, carrying fine particles that catch the silver glow and scatter it in sharp flickers. When the particles settle on the frost, they shimmer briefly before sinking into the hardened surface. The boundary between warm and cold mist across the plains tightens sharply. The swirling line between the two currents becomes more tense, the warm side pulling slightly inward as the cold front expands. The creatures watching from the warm zone adjust their positions once more. Their silhouettes rearrange, spreading out in a wider arc, maintaining the distance instinct seems to require whenever the ancient bloom enters this stage of its cycle. The small creature on the slope takes another few steps forward. It moves with slow precision, placing each limb carefully into the frost before shifting its weight. It stops just at the point where the cold mist begins to rise in thicker curls, its eyes fixed on the core of the bloom. Its posture is focused, as though it's waiting for the moment the bloom transitions from release to revelation. Inside, the glow sharpens. The silver brightens until it's almost white, then pulls inward again, leaving a faint ring of violet light along the inner fibers. The contraction is long and steady this time, lasting several breaths, drawing in every strand like the bloom is preparing to release something far larger than before. The ridge braces again. Cracks race through the frost network in thin branching lines, each one running outward before fading. The soil shifts slightly under the pressure, rising in subtle ridges that ripple around the base before settling back into place. It's a controlled upheaval, the kind that shows this plant has been performing this cycle for longer than its surroundings can remember. The sixth petal trembles. It doesn't crack yet. It shivers in place, its frost vibrating along the surface as the inner pressure pushes against it. A thin line appears at the tip, glowing faintly with the silver light seeping through. It widens slowly, too slow to hear at first, until a sudden snap breaks the quiet. The crack runs halfway down the petal before stopping, leaving the rest to form in shorter bursts across the layers. Inside the chamber, movement begins to change. The core doesn't just pulse, it rotates. A slow, heavy turn that shifts the light in spiraling patterns along the fibers. The motion is subtle, but the effect is immediate. The mist pouring from the top of the bloom grows thicker and steadier, rising in a strong, continuous stream that widens into a towering plume. The small creature senses it instantly. It lowers its head again, backing up one slow step. Not out of fear, but recognition. This is the moment the bloom begins its main cycle. The cold release so far was only preparation. The sixth petal cracks again. This time the line travels all the way down, splitting the plate cleanly. Frost sprays outward in a wide arc as the petal shakes once, loosening from the pressure behind it. It swings outward in a slow, heavy motion, joining the others and completing the wide circle around the bloom. With 6 petals open, the core chamber is fully visible for the first time. The central mass glows brighter now, its surface covered in thick, ridged lines that flex with each rotation. The color deepens into a shade between silver and pale blue, its edges shifting with faint violet pulses. Cold vapor pours from it in constant waves, rolling out through the open chamber in thick layers that blend with the mist outside. The air changes. It becomes heavier, pulling downward like a slow current. The frost at the base of the bloom shifts as the pressure deepens, cracking in new patterns that spread outward. The ridge responds in its own quiet way, settling into the weight of what's being released. The bloom has entered the midpoint of its cycle, the stage where the release becomes continuous, unstoppable, and far stronger than anything the younger blooms across the plains can produce. And with each passing moment, the ancient plant draws closer to revealing why it stores this cold, and what happens when the cycle reaches its peak. The 6 open petals form a wide ring around the core, each one held steady by thick fibers that keep them locked into place. The frost coating their surfaces grows denser by the moment, spreading outward in thin branching lines that catch the shifting glow from the chamber. The cold in the air has reached a point where even the mist seems sluggish, its movements slower, thicker, as if every particle has gained weight. Inside the chamber, the rotation of the core continues, slow, deliberate, and steady enough that each turn seems to draw more light into the inner folds. The silver tone deepens once more, and faint streaks of blue run along the ridges as they flex. With every rotation, another wave of cold pushes outward, keeping the ridge wrapped in a temperature far lower than anything the younger blooms could produce. Across the plains, the warm mist from the younger flowers retreats a little further, pulled inward by the shift in air pressure. The creatures gathered at the boundary step back again, forming a broader curve. Their silhouettes blur in the haze, each one holding its position with the same cautious discipline. Whatever happens at this stage of the cycle is clearly something they've watched many times before. Only the small creature on the slope remains close. It stands at the very edge of the expanding cold mist, its limbs braced but calm. Frost gathers along its back in fine, glittering patterns, but it doesn't move to brush them off. Its eyes stay fixed on the bloom's core, tracking every pulse of light with quiet focus. Another shift builds within the bloom. The glow contracts sharply, pulling inward until the chamber darkens for the first time since the petals opened. The fibers stop flexing and hold still, frozen mid-movement. The ridge responds seconds later, a deep, low vibration passing through the ground, subtle but noticeable, as if something beneath the bloom has locked into place. Then the core expands. The release is immediate and powerful, a broad wave of cold that sweeps out in every direction. The mist thickens into a solid sheet, rolling outward with enough force to cover the entire ridge within moments. Frost forms instantly wherever the wave touches, coating the ground in a new layer so thick it swallows the old one entirely. The temperature drops again, another sudden, sharp step down that makes the air feel denser than before. The petals respond with a soft shudder. Each one shifts by only a few inches, but the movement sends a thin rain of ice fragments to the ground. The cracks along their surfaces widen, adjusting for the new pressure inside the bloom. The fibers holding them flex inward, tightening and anchoring the structure even more securely into the ridge. A new detail becomes visible inside the chamber. Now that the cold wave has passed, the glow from the core stabilizes into a deeper blue-silver tone. The ridges on its surface separate slightly, revealing narrow gaps that pulse with a faint, colder light. These gaps expand and contract in perfect sync with the rotation, releasing thin lines of vapor that spiral around the core before drifting outward. The spiral is deliberate, a controlled pattern rather than a random release. The entire chamber is built to guide the cold outward in these slow, cycling flows. The small creature reacts first. It tilts its head slightly, taking one measured step back. A thin layer of frost forms instantly on the ground beneath its feet, hardening around its limbs. It lifts each foot carefully to avoid getting stuck, then settles into a stance that shows it knows the bloom is reaching a more intense phase. The boundary across the plains responds too. The warm mist shrinks hard this time. The cold wave reaching it causes the warm vapor to recoil sharply, retreating several meters in a single breath. The creatures at the border shift as well, some backing up, others lowering themselves slightly, all of them watching the ridge without turning away. Back at the bloom, the core rotates faster. Only a little, but enough that the light inside the chamber flickers in longer, more pronounced bands. The gaps between the ridged segments widen further, releasing steady streams of cold vapor that travel along the inner fibers before escaping into the open air. The mist rising above the bloom thickens into a towering plume. It doesn't spread outward anymore. It rises straight up, dense enough that its edges are visible against the darkness. Ice crystals form within the plume at a constant rate, drifting down in slow spirals that gather across the open petals and the frost-covered ground. The seventh petal begins to loosen. Cracks form quickly at the tip, branching downward in clean, predictable lines. Frost falls away in steady strips as the pressure inside the bloom pushes outward. The petal trembles once, catching the light from the rotating core, then holds itself there, waiting for the next pulse. It doesn't wait long. The core contracts again, this time harder than before. The chamber darkens for a heartbeat, the inner fibers tightening around the mass of glowing plant matter. The pulse that follows is heavy, the strongest yet. The wave of cold throws a ripple across the entire ridge, a slow shudder that moves through the frost in visible rings. The mist thickens into a rolling swell that spreads across the slope and down into the plains, stopping only when it meets the warm boundary. Frost races outward faster than ever, covering everything in its path. The seventh petal opens. It swings outward in a long, smooth arc, revealing another section of the inner chamber and completing a ring that looks less like a flower now and more like a structured cooling system built by the planet itself. With 7 petals open, the bloom is nearly at full capacity. The cold it releases is constant now, flowing in steady streams that reshape the ridge in slow, controlled waves. The core rotates with heavier motion, its glow cycling between silver, blue, and violet in smooth transitions. The creature on the slope doesn't move again. It simply waits, eyes fixed on the chamber, because it knows the cycle isn't finished yet. The bloom has one final stage ahead, and judging by the way the core pulses now, the last shift will be the strongest of all. The 7th petal settles into its open position, and the ridge adjusts to the new surge of cold pouring from the chamber. Frost becomes so dense around the bloom that the ground looks as though it's formed a single continuous sheet of pale glass, smooth enough that every tiny vibration glides across it in slow echoes. The air is thick with drifting crystals, each one turning gently as they fall, reflecting fragments of the blue-silver glow. The core continues its rotation, but the speed is different now. Each turn feels heavier, more focused, as if the plant is directing its stored cold into one final burst. The bands of light running along the ridges grow sharper, No longer soft pulses, but firm, steady lines that brighten with every contraction. The mist above the bloom forms a long pillar that reaches high into the atmosphere. It's dense enough to bend slightly under its own weight, but it never breaks, just rises, forming layer after layer of cold vapor that spreads slowly outward at the top. Tiny crystals break away from the plume, drifting down in long spirals that settle on everything in a soft, continuous fall. The small creature on the slope shifts its stance again. It crouches lower than before, limbs tucked in, its body angled slightly away from the bloom. This isn't fear, it's preparation. Every movement it makes now is deliberate, timed with the pulses coming from the core. It seems to recognize the pattern and knows exactly when to brace. Across the plains, the creatures behind the warm boundary react too. Some step further back, some lower their bodies. A few stand tall, stretching their limbs as if sensing the cold reach across the boundary. None cross it. They understand the cycle intimately, and this stage demands distance. Inside the bloom, the core tightens. The ridges contract so sharply that the inner chamber briefly pulls inward, dimming the light in every direction. The petals creak from the pressure as the mass at the center compresses into a denser shape, forming a near-perfect sphere of cold, glowing plant matter. A long, low vibration travels through the ridge. It's slower than previous pulses, but far deeper, the kind that moves through the soil rather than over it. The frost cracks in thin spiderweb patterns that stretch outward in all directions. The ground dips slightly beneath the bloom, then rises, as if the entire structure is anchoring itself for what's coming. The eighth petal cracks, not gradually, all at once. A single sharp break runs from the tip to the base in a clean line. Frost explodes outward in a burst of shimmering flakes, scattering across the ridge like powdered ice. The petal loosens, but it doesn't open yet. It holds itself in a half-shifted position, waiting for the next pulse from the core. The glow in the chamber brightens again. The color deepens into a colder blue, one that edges into violet at the outer ridges. The patterns inside the chamber twist more visibly now, forming spirals that travel through the fibers in long, sweeping motions. Each twist pushes out a layer of mist that flows along the inner walls before spilling into the open air. The cold intensifies. The air becomes so dense with chilled vapor that it forms visible currents drifting slowly across the ridge. The frost on the petals grows in thick layers, building outward like additional plates. The temperature drops again, enough that the boundary across the plains visibly tightens, the warm mist compressing into a narrower band. The creatures beyond it take several steps backwards in near unison. This is the moment they've been waiting for, the signal that the bloom is entering its peak. The core contracts one more time. The glow snaps inward, brightening until the entire chamber flashes with cold, concentrated light. The fibers pull tight against the mass, and the ridges flatten briefly before expanding again. Then the release comes. Slow at first, a broad wave of cold pushing outward in a heavy roll that glides across the ridge, thickening the frost again. The mist thickens into a curtain, so dense that visibility drops to only a few meters. The crystals falling from the sky increase sharply, drifting down in a near-constant shower. The eighth petal swings open. It moves fast enough to send a short burst of air outward, scattering the mist in a wide arc. Once the petal locks into place, the chamber becomes almost fully exposed, a deep, spiraling cavity rotating around the glowing core. But the bloom hasn't reached its peak yet, not until the final shift. Inside the chamber, the core's rotation slows to a near stop. The glow becomes stable, a steady cold light with no pulses. The fibers inside hold completely still, forming a rigid structure around the central mass. The small creature reacts instantly. It lowers into a full crouch, pressing itself as close to the frost as it can. A fine ring of crystals forms around its outline, pulled inward by the sudden pressure shift. Across the plains, every distant creature freezes in place. They don't move, they don't adjust, they simply wait. Because the bloom is gathering everything it has for one last colossal release. The air pressure drops around the ridge. Frost cracks in long twisting lines. Mist compresses inward. The petals tighten slightly, as if locking themselves to withstand the force. The core draws in completely, shrinking into a tight sphere of concentrated cold. The peak is seconds away, and the ridge holds still, the world quietly bracing for the ancient bloom's final release. The compressed core at the center of the bloom holds completely still. Its glow sharpens into a single, unwavering point of blue-silver light, bright enough that the frost along the inner fibers glints like metal under a clear night. Nothing moves inside the chamber now. No pulses, no rotation, no shifting vapor. Everything waits. The ridge feels the pressure first. A thin, deep vibration spreads outward beneath the frost, too quiet to hear, but strong enough to feel through the ground. The frost doesn't crack this time. It tightens, pulling into smaller, denser formations that press against each other until the ridge almost looks polished. Even the mist above the bloom flattens slightly, weighed down by the air drawing inward. The petals lock into their final positions. Their edges pull just a few millimeters tighter, the fibers beneath them flexing and then freezing into place. Frost thickens along the seams, forming rigid bands that look like structural supports rather than decoration. Whatever energy the bloom is about to release, the plant clearly needs every layer anchored firmly to withstand it. The small creature on the slope lowers further until its body is almost flush with the frost. Its limbs stretch out slightly, balancing itself. Its eyes never leave the chamber. It knows this exact moment, the stillness before the release, the way the cold draws inward like the bloom is holding its entire cycle in a single breath. Across the plains, the warm mist retreats again. The line separating warm and cold pulls sharply inward, shrinking by several meters in a matter of seconds. The creatures standing behind it move with the shift, adjusting their stance without panic. They spread out in a wide formation, leaving a clear corridor facing the ridge as though to give the burst a place to move through. Inside the chamber, the core begins to change. The sphere of condensed cold doesn't pulse, it fractures. Hairline cracks form across its surface in delicate, branching patterns that glow with the same intense blue-silver light. The cracks spread slowly at first, then accelerate, crossing each other in intricate lines until the sphere looks more like a cluster of frozen plates barely holding together. The temperature drops sharply. The frost at the base of the bloom thickens in an instant, climbing the lower petals in thin vertical streaks. The mist swirling near the ground crystallizes fully, becoming a drifting blanket of soft, pale flakes that slide across the ridge like slow-moving dust. Then the core shifts inward again, the final contraction. The sphere tightens into itself, the cracks narrowing for a heartbeat, the glow focusing into the very center. And then the release happens. It doesn't explode. It expands. A heavy, rolling surge of cold rushes outward from the core in a wide sphere that fills the chamber before spilling out past the open petals. The wave moves slowly but with enormous force, pushing the mist outward in a smooth wall. Frost forms instantly wherever the wave touches. Thick, solid layers that spread across the ground like fresh sheets of ice forming over water. The ridge echoes with a low, deep sound that travels through the frost instead of the air. It spreads through the ground in steady ripples, each one pushing the cold wave further out and down the slope. The eighth petal trembles under the pressure but holds firmly. The frost forming along its edges cracks and reforms in quick, sharp patterns as the cold wave continues to push through the open chamber. The mist above the bloom shoots upward. The plume that had been rising steadily now surges, widening into a massive column that reaches high into the upper atmosphere. Ice crystals form inside the column at a rate too fast to track, pouring down in thick streams that coat the petals, the ridge, and the surrounding ground in a constant fall of glittering debris. Across the plains, the warm boundary collapses. The cold surge pushes into it with controlled force, the warm mist scattering and retreating in several directions at once. The creatures behind the boundary step further back, some lowering themselves to the ground, others standing tall as the temperature drops even from that distance. None turn away. They simply wait for the wave to settle. The small creature on the slope holds its position. The wave washes past it, frost layering over its back in thick sheets. It doesn't flee. It just lowers itself more, letting the cold move over it, as if this part of the cycle is something its species is built to endure. The cold wave continues until it reaches the plains. It slows gradually, settling into a thin sheet of drifting vapor that spreads in a perfectly even layer across the ground. The frost pattern covering the ridge shifts again, forming subtle channels that guide the leftover vapor back toward the bloom. Only when the wave is spent does the chamber dim. The core stops glowing. The cracks across its surface fade into dull, frost-covered lines. The sphere no longer pulses or contracts, it rests. The bloom holds its position, petals open wide, the chamber fully exposed. For the first time since the cycle began, everything is still again. The cold release is complete. But the bloom doesn't close, it simply pauses, holding its open form, letting the last of the mist drift out of the chamber in slow, steady curls. Whatever happens next is part of the second half of the cycle, the long, slow settling that only begins after the peak has passed. The ancient bloom remains fully open long after the wave of cold has settled. The petals stay locked in their wide ring, rigid and unmoving, coated in thick layers of frost that still crack quietly under the lingering pressure. The core sits motionless in the chamber, its once brilliant glow faded to a dull, icy blue. The fine cracks along its surface no longer shine. They look sealed, as though the plant has closed off the channels that fed the release. The ridge holds the last of the cold in a heavy silence. The ground is covered in a hardened sheet of frost, so dense it no longer looks like individual crystals, but a single fused layer stretching across the whole ridge. The mist that once rolled thick across the slope has thinned into a low, pale haze that barely rises above the ground. What remains drifts in slow patches, hugging the frozen terrain instead of swirling into the air. The air pressure slowly climbs back to normal. It's subtle, the faintest shift that lifts a few drifting crystals and sends them sliding gently across the frost. The atmosphere feels less compressed now, the weight of the bloom's release easing bit by bit. The plume above the chamber begins to thin, narrowing from a towering column into a softer, straighter line that rises upward before dispersing into the upper atmosphere. The small creature on the slope finally moves, not quickly, not cautiously, just steadily. It uncurls itself from the frost, lifting its limbs one at a time, careful not to break the newly formed ice sheet beneath it. Frost falls from its back in a soft shower, leaving thin trails behind as it shakes itself clean. It steps forward a few paces, stopping at the very edge of the chamber's reach. It's waiting, not for danger, but for the next stage. Across the plains, the warm mist from the younger blooms slowly regains its shape. The boundary that had collapsed during the release begins to reform, stretching back into a soft, rounded line. The warm vapor drifts outward again, reclaiming the space it lost. The creatures watching from behind it begin to move as well. Some straighten their posture, others take slow steps forward. None cross the invisible threshold yet, but the tension in their stance eases. The worst of the cold has passed. Back on the ridge, the bloom begins its slow adjustment phase. The inner fibers that once pulsed and flexed now hold steady, maintaining their wide configuration. The frost clinging to them thickens as the temperature stabilizes, forming solid ridges along the spiral shapes. The chamber floor remains coated in a thin layer of crystalline ice, cracked in places where the cold wave hit hardest. The petals shift slightly, the first movement since the peak release. It's not much, just a small relaxation in their anchored position, like the tension holding them rigid is fading now that the burst is over. Frost cracks quietly along the seams. A few flakes break loose and fall into the chamber, landing with soft, muted taps. The air inside the chamber begins to warm, barely, but enough that the inner frost changes texture, becoming more granular rather than sharp and glass-like. This is not true warmth. It's simply the plant's internal structure equalizing after expelling so much cold. Another change follows. The cracks across the core start to narrow, slowly, deliberately. The plant is sealing the sphere back together, one thin line at a time. The segments pull inward, locking into place until the shape becomes more whole, more solid, with each passing minute. The faint icy glow remains, but it no longer pushes outward. It just lingers deep inside, soft and steady. The mist on the ridge continues thinning. Each minute, the haze becomes more transparent, revealing more of the terrain beneath it. The frost dulls slightly in color, losing the fresh shine it had right after the release. The air no longer holds the heavy weight of the earlier cold. It's still freezing, still harsh, but no longer crushing. The small creature takes another step. It approaches the base of the bloom, stopping just short of the thick frost ring. It lowers its head, examining the inner chamber with slow, careful movements. A soft vibration runs along its back, not fear, but recognition. This is part of its nightly pattern, an ancient behavior tied directly to the bloom cycle. The ridge responds subtly again. Fine cracks spread across the frozen ground, not from pressure, but from the slow shift in temperature as the plant's release settles. These cracks form delicate webs that stretch outward before fading into the larger frost sheet. The ground seems to breathe again, returning to the quiet rhythm of the planet's cold night. From above, the plume finally breaks apart. The long column of vapor thins into scattered streams, rising in loose curls before disappearing into the dark sky. Ice crystals continue falling, but only lightly now, a thin, gentle drift that settles on the petals and the ridge like the final remnants of a passing weather front. The creatures across the plains begin to move toward the boundary, cautiously, patiently. They test the air, stepping one pace at a time, waiting for the temperature to climb just enough that the cold current no longer threatens their range. The bloom remains open, its inner chamber quiet, its core resting, its petals still wide. This is the long pause that follows every peak, the moment the planet gives its oldest bloom time to stabilize before the next phase begins. And in the stillness that follows, the ridge feels like a place caught between two halves of the night, the violent burst behind it, and whatever slow, unfolding change is about to begin. The ridge stays quiet for a long stretch. The bloom doesn't move, and the air holds its steady chill, the kind that settles deeply and doesn't shift without reason. The frost layer across the ground gradually loses the sharpness it gained during the peak release. It becomes smoother, more compact, the perfect surface for the cold to settle into its stable shape. The core, now dim and sealed, rests in the center of the chamber without a single flicker. The cracks along its surface have drawn almost fully closed, leaving only thin lines where the earlier fracture once spread. Every breath of mist inside the bloom has faded away, leaving nothing more than faint curls of vapor that slip from the inner fibers before disappearing. The small creature near the base steps closer. It approaches the frost ring in slow, measured movements, stopping only when its body meets the point where warmth from its limbs meets the deep chill of the ground. It doesn't cross that boundary yet. It simply observes the chamber, as though checking for any hint the bloom might still release something unexpected. Above the ridge, the air clears even more. The last remnants of the plume have dissolved into the upper atmosphere, leaving the night sky sharp and steady. A thin band of faint starlight reflects across the frost, giving the ridge a simple, even glow that feels nothing like the earlier chaos. The atmosphere finally feels settled. The petals shift again. Not a full movement, only a slight loosening at the joints where the layers connect. Frost breaks quietly and falls in soft fragments to the ground. The petals don't begin to close. They just settle, adjusting their position so the bloom structure can hold comfortably after the intense strain of the peak release. Inside the chamber, the frost changes texture. It softens into a more powdery form, the edges rounding off as the temperature in the center rises by a fraction. The change is tiny, barely noticeable, but enough that the frost begins to form small clusters instead of flat sheets. The inner fibers open by narrow degrees too, not enough to move, just enough to allow for airflow now that the worst of the cycle is over. The ridge responds once more. Thin cracks appear in the frost sheet, branching slowly outward as the ground adjusts to the temperature shift. Some cracks connect with others, forming large, shallow patterns across the surface. The ice doesn't break apart. It simply expands, reshaping itself naturally as the cold settles deeper into the ground. The small creature finally steps over the frost ring. Its stride is steady. It places its limbs carefully across the frozen surface, testing each point before shifting weight onto it. Frost cracks faintly beneath its feet, but the layer is strong enough to support the creature's light movements. It stops at the very edge of the bloom's chamber, close, but not too close, and lifts its head again. This is the part of the night where the bloom no longer dominates the ridge. Instead, the ridge returns to its slower rhythm, and the bloom becomes a quiet presence, rather than an active force. The cold still radiates from the chamber, but it no longer expands outward. It simply lingers. In the distance, the younger blooms reflect the change. Their warm bioluminescent mist spreads further again, reclaiming the space where the cold wave once pushed through. The glowing haze drifts like a slow tide, flowing across the plains until it meets the ridge's edge again. The boundary is soft now, not a harsh divide as before, but a gentle meeting of warm and cold currents. The creatures in the warm zone move forward. Not all at once, not quickly. One by one they step closer, testing the air. Some stand higher on their limbs, others lower themselves to the ground. None cross into the cold ridge yet, but the distance between the two groups narrows until only a thin line of open terrain separates them from the frozen slope. Back on the ridge, the bloom begins its next subtle shift. A faint vibration runs through the inner fibers, not from pressure, but from release. The plant is adjusting internally, preparing to draw in the surrounding air as part of its recovery stage. The frost around the chamber shivers in small lines, reacting to the movement inside. The core's glow changes slightly, not brighter, deeper. A soft, muted tone of blue slowly fills the cracks still visible across its surface. It isn't the intense glow of earlier. This one is subtle, calm, resting. The plant is beginning to store energy again, building the first traces of what will become tomorrow's cycle. The air on the ridge warms barely, just enough that the crystals floating near the ground drift a little higher before settling again. The frost remains thick, but less brittle. The cold is no longer sharp, it's steady, even, part of the planet's natural resting temperature, rather than the aggressive chill of the bloom's peak. The small creature remains near the chamber. It lifts its head slightly, breathing in the faint vapors drifting from the inner fibers. Whatever scent or chemical the bloom produces at this stage clearly matters to the creature. It takes its time, stepping around the edge in a slow half circle, pausing occasionally to test the frost or glance at the open petals. Across the plains, the larger creatures begin to settle as well. Some curl into resting shapes. Others stand quietly, their limbs folded beneath them. The warm mist becomes thicker, rising into deeper swells as the younger blooms shift into their late-night pattern, the stage where their heat output slowly decreases, preparing for sunrise. Everything is moving into the quieter half of the night now. The ancient bloom is no longer the center of the world's attention, but it's still open, still cooling, still holding the remains of its cycle. The ridge feels like a place where something has passed, leaving space for the rest of the night to breathe again. And beneath the frost, the plant is already beginning the earliest steps of rebuilding the cold it will release when the next night comes. The ridge holds its steady cold as the night stretches on. The air no longer shifts in heavy waves. Instead, it settles into a smooth, unmoving layer that hugs the ground. Frost continues to thicken in some places, but the changes now are slow and natural, guided by the planet's normal cooling rather than the bloom's release. The ancient bloom stays open, its petals angled outward in a perfect circle, each one stiff with solid frost. Thin ridges of ice trace along the fibers at the seams, forming patterns that haven't moved since the peak. The inner chamber remains quiet, the faint bluish glow from the sealed core steady and calm. Inside, the cracks that once split across the core tighten further, shrinking into hairline lines nearly invisible from the ridge. The faint pulse of cold stored deep within is minimal now, a soft echo rather than a force. The plant's energy is shifting inward again, beginning the slow work of rebuilding what it released. The small creature near the chamber steps gently across the frost, following a path it clearly knows well. It circles the bloom, never touching the inner fibers but staying close enough to inspect the chamber from every angle. Its breaths come in slow, pale trails that disappear into the low haze drifting across the ridge. Every so often it stops and lowers its head to the frost, touching the surface lightly. Whatever it's sensing, it seems to be checking the stability of the ground, the temperature, or simply confirming that the bloom's cycle has truly entered its resting stage. Across the plains, the younger blooms shift too. Their warm mist softens, rising in thinner layers that ripple gently as they settle. The glow around them dims slightly, losing the rich orange tones that dominated earlier in the night. They're not closing yet, just easing into their late-night state, where the temperature they release becomes more consistent and less vibrant. The creatures that live among them stretch and move again. A few step farther into the open, testing the boundary between warm and cold air. They don't cross the invisible line between the plains and the ridge, but they draw closer than before, sensing the shift as the bloom's influence weakens. Some stand upright to get a clearer view. Others remain low, with long limbs tucked beneath them, watching in quiet groups. The air between the plains and the ridge becomes more balanced. Warm and cold mist mix in a gentle gradient, smoothing the contrast that earlier was sharp and defined. The faint swirl of vapor where the two currents meet turns soft and slow, drifting in loose spirals that hang for minutes before settling. Back on the ridge, the bloom begins another subtle transition. The inner fibers loosen slightly, opening by a barely visible amount. The movement is slow enough that frost forms along their edges as they shift, creating a soft scraping sound each time a fragment breaks away. A faint breeze escapes from the chamber, thin, almost weightless, carrying the last traces of chilled vapor outward in a low curl. The core seems to respond to the shift. Its internal glow warms by a fraction, deepening into a more muted blue. It's not actually warmer in temperature. The color simply reflects the plant changing from release mode to recovery mode. The glow inside stops flickering entirely, becoming a steady bead of light surrounded by thick layers of frost. The small creature senses the change instantly. It stands taller, stretching its limbs before taking a few silent steps back from the chamber. It doesn't retreat far, just enough to give the bloom room to complete its transition. Its eyes watch carefully, catching the faint reflections of the inner glow as the chamber settles into this new phase. Another sound rolls through the ridge, a soft, long vibration, nothing like the deep, heavy pulses from earlier. This one is thin and constant, more like the ground adjusting its temperature than reacting to the bloom. Frost shifts across the slope, settling into smoother blankets as the ridge cools at a consistent pace again. Cracks expand and then freeze, forming delicate white veins stretching farther down the incline. Above, the sky takes on a more transparent tone. With the last of the bloom's vapor drifting away, the upper atmosphere clears, exposing more of the faint starlight. The ridge catches the reflections easily, casting soft highlights across the frost and creating long, pale streaks where the terrain slopes downward. The creatures across the plains begin to relax. A few move back toward the warm blooms, settling around the glowing mist in quiet clusters. Their limbs fold neatly beneath them as they rest in shallow hollows made warm by the open flowers. Some remain near the boundary, still watching the ridge, waiting for the final cues that the bloom has reached complete stillness. The ridge itself feels quieter now, not empty, just calmer, settled, unhurried. The bloom continues to cool, the chamber's glow dimming to a faint, steady pulse. The frost around the core has thickened into a rigid shield. The petals hold their open positions with no visible strain, their weight evenly distributed across the icy base. This is the point in the cycle where the ancient bloom waits. No heat, no cold burst, no shifting mist, just a long, quiet stabilization stage, the part of the night where the bloom rests completely before the closing sequence begins. And the ridge stays still with it, giving the world time to breathe again before anything changes. The ridge remains still for a long time after the bloom settles into its open rest. Nothing shifts, nothing pulses, nothing pushes outward anymore. The frost holds its steady pattern across the ground, shaped earlier by the bloom's peak but now completely undisturbed. Only small crystals drift across the surface, carried by faint air currents that slip low along the terrain. Inside the chamber, the core stays quiet, its once powerful glow now reduced to a soft, muted blue. Thin frost covers most of it, creating a smooth surface that catches only the faintest trace of light. The cracks that once split the sphere have fully sealed, leaving behind faint, pale lines that serve as subtle reminders of the cycle it just completed. The inner fibers have relaxed. They no longer pulse or flex. They no longer guide cold outward. They simply hold their positions, curled gently inward like a complex lattice of natural supports stabilizing the chamber. The small creature that spent most of the night monitoring the bloom takes a few more cautious steps around the chamber. It no longer examines the frost or tests the temperature. Its movements now are slower, less analytical, almost ritualistic. It steps from one point to another, forming a loose path around the bloom before finally stopping near the frost ring it had crossed earlier. It sits, calm, alert, but no longer tense. Across the plains, the younger blooms continue their late-night phase. The warm mist around them has thinned into soft layers that rise slowly and fall just as gently. Their glow has faded into quieter tones, still warm, still rich in color, but no longer vibrant. The creatures in the warm fields rest in clusters, their silhouettes rising and sinking as they breathe. A few remain awake, watching the ridge from afar, but even they have become still. The boundary between warm and cold shifts one last time. It evens out, no longer retreating or advancing. The air between the two zones blends gradually, forming a smooth gradient that settles into a stable front. The faint swirl where the mists met earlier has vanished entirely, replaced by a quiet, consistent flow. On the ridge, the bloom begins its slowest stage. Not closing, not shrinking, just preparing. The petals shift again, the smallest movement yet. They relax, lowering by a fraction of a degree, frost cracking softly between the joints. The sound is faint, a thin, brittle noise that fades quickly into the cold air. The plant isn't retracting yet, it's simply loosening the last bits of tension left over from the cycle. The chamber responds in subtle ways. The glow inside dims further, becoming a soft point rather than a full wash of light. The inner frost breaks into finer grains as the temperature equalizes naturally instead of being forced by the bloom's release. The air inside the chamber clears completely, revealing the structure in full detail. Every layer, every ridge, every line shaped by years of night cycles. The creature watches all of this quietly. It rises again, stepping slowly toward the edge of the chamber. It doesn't climb inside. It doesn't disturb the frost. It just lowers its body slightly and stays there, as though acknowledging something in the bloom's behavior that only its species fully understands. Higher above the ridge, the night sky begins its own quiet transformation. The stars lose a fraction of their intensity, not fading but softening as the upper atmosphere shifts. A very faint, cold grey light touches the horizon on the far side of the plains, still distant, still muted, but present enough to signal that dawn is beginning the earliest part of its approach. The creatures on the plains feel it immediately. Some lift their heads, others rise to their feet in slow, easy motions. Nothing urgent, just the natural reaction to the planet's slow turn toward light. The warm blooms begin their subtle pre-dawn adjustments too. The glow deepens into softer shades of gold and orange. Their petals remain open, but the mist rising from them thins into fine wisps that drift upward instead of spreading outward. Their warmth holds steady, creating pockets of calm that help the creatures prepare for the temperature shift that dawn brings. Back on the ridge, the ancient bloom senses the change as well. A faint tremor passes through the inner fibers, not from strain, but from the plant adjusting to the planet's approaching daylight. The frost around the chamber tightens in small patches, holding firm against the minor rise in temperature. The petals shift one more time, lowering by another small degree as the bloom begins its earliest closing behaviors. The creature by the chamber reacts. It steps back slowly, turning its head to watch the horizon. Its posture changes, becoming more upright, more alert. Whatever bond it shares with the bloom, this moment marks the point where its attention shifts from the plant to the world around it. A thin breeze drifts across the ridge. It carries a different texture now, still cold, but less sharp. The frost reacts with a quiet shiver, tiny crystals sliding across the surface as the air begins its slow mixing with the warming atmosphere ahead of dawn. The bloom remains fully open for now, its inner chamber exposed to the dim starlight that still covers most of the sky. But the change has already started. The petals' relaxed posture, the soft dimming of the core, the quiet settling of the ridge, all of it marks the final phase of the night. The small creature takes its last slow steps away from the bloom, leaving faint prints in the frost as it moves back down the slope. It joins the thin line of terrain where warm and cold air meet, pausing there as though waiting for the world to shift fully before deciding where to go next. Behind it, the ancient bloom rests, open, silent, preparing for dawn. And as the first fragile threads of morning light begin to creep across the horizon, the world holds steady around it, a planet built on cycles of cold and warmth, waiting patiently for the next slow change to unfold.